Welcome to Horror Echo. Hello everyone. I'm here to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. But before you do, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're from and what time it is where you're watching. Now, get comfortable, relax, and let me take you on a journey into the unknown. The Whispering Pines. Prologue. A group of 5 lifelong friends decide to spend their weekend away from the chaos of their busy lives. They book a secluded cabin deep in the woods near an eerie, mist-covered lake. The cabin, rented from an old company with glowing reviews, promises peace and relaxation, far from the distractions of their daily routines. But as night falls, the whispers begin. What seemed like an idyllic escape quickly becomes a nightmare, as the group begins to suspect they're not alone in the cabin. There's something lurking in the shadows, something watching them, and it's waiting for them to discover its tragic, terrifying secret. Chapter 1: Into the Quiet. It had been a long week for everyone, and the idea of escaping into the wilderness sounded like the perfect remedy for their tired souls. Julie, the natural planner, was the one who found the cabin. Her description of it was simple: a charming retreat near a lake, surrounded by towering trees. Quiet. Peaceful. Perfect for us. The pictures she showed were stunning. A beautiful log cabin with huge windows opening to scenic views of the woods. The group, Julie, Mark, Heather, Kevin, and Rachel, were thrilled by the idea and immediately agreed. They rented the cabin for the weekend. It was situated in a remote area, far from any other houses or civilization. The journey there was long, and as they drove, the feeling of isolation deepened. The road became narrower, winding through tall trees that seemed to whisper with the wind. Kevin, always the joker, commented on how creepy the place felt, but everyone laughed it off. When they arrived, the cabin was everything they had hoped for: rustic, cozy, and peaceful. It sat near the edge of the lake, its reflective waters shimmering in the late afternoon sun. The place looked perfect for a weekend retreat. But as they unloaded the car, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Are we sure this is the right place?" he asked, looking around the woods that seemed to close in on the cabin. Julie laughed, dismissing his concern. "What's wrong, Mark? You scared of a little nature?" But Mark's unease only grew as the sun began to set. He noticed something strange. The trees seemed to form a tight, almost unnatural circle around the cabin, as if they were protecting it, or hiding something. The group settled into the cabin, quickly unpacking and getting comfortable. Heather, who had an interest in the paranormal, was the first to notice something odd. A portrait hung on the wall above the fireplace, a faded picture of a woman in a black dress, standing in front of the cabin. Her face was somber, and she seemed out of place in the otherwise peaceful setting. "Who's she?" Heather asked, pointing at the portrait. Julie looked up at the painting. "Oh, I didn't even notice that. I guess it's part of the cabin's history. Maybe the old owners?" But as the night fell, a strange energy filled the house. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, even though the fire was crackling in the hearth. Rachel, who had been reading on the couch, looked up and frowned. "Did anyone hear that?" The room fell silent. There was a soft, barely audible sound coming from the corner of the room. It was like the wind, but there was no breeze. "I think it's just the house settling," Mark said, trying to sound casual. But even as he said it, the whispers grew louder. The first night passed without much incident, but the unease was palpable. As the group fell asleep, Mark was the last to close his eyes. The house felt different when the lights went out, heavy, oppressive. And in the silence, there was something moving. Something he couldn't see, but he could feel. Chapter 2, The Unseen Watcher. As the night wore on, a heavy fog settled around the cabin, creeping in from the lake like a slow-moving blanket. The trees swayed softly, their branches scratching against the windows like the fingers of unseen hands. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the fire flickering in the hearth. The five friends, exhausted from the drive, settled into a restless sleep. But Mark couldn't sleep. His mind raced as he lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt as if something was lurking in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the firelight. A sensation of being watched crept up his spine, sending shivers through his body. He turned his head toward the window, where the fog now pressed against the glass, obscuring the view of the lake. The trees were barely visible, their forms twisting in the mist. Mark could hear something now, something faint but undeniable, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It came from outside, then from within the house. The house was settling. It had to be. But then, the sound came again, closer this time, almost like footsteps. Mark sat up, his heart racing. He glanced at the others, but they were all sound asleep, their breathing deep and steady. He was alone in his growing panic. He slowly reached for the lamp beside his bed, flicking the switch. The dim light illuminated the room in a warm, amber glow, but it only made the shadows stretch longer and darker. With a gulp, Mark pushed himself out of bed. His bare feet hit the cool wood of the floor, and he crept toward the door. He glanced back once more, unsure of what he was searching for, but the room seemed just as it had been when they first arrived, still, safe, and deceptively ordinary. He opened the door, slipping out into the narrow hallway. The floor creaked under his weight, and as he stepped toward the stairs that led to the main floor, he heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a low whisper. It was so faint at first that he wasn't sure if it was real. But it grew louder as he descended the stairs. "Help me," the voice whispered, almost pleading. It was soft and female, but distorted, like it was coming from far away. Mark's heart hammered in his chest. His instinct screamed at him to turn back, but something about the voice, it tugged at him, pulling him forward. He reached the bottom of the stairs and looked into the living room. The fire was still burning low, casting long shadows across the walls. The air felt colder, thicker. And in the corner of the room, near the portrait of the woman, something shifted. He squinted into the dim light, but there was nothing there. Just the stillness of the house. Suddenly, a gust of wind howled outside, rattling the windows and causing the fire to flicker. The whisper returned, louder this time, but it wasn't coming from the walls, it was coming from the portrait itself. "Help me! You must help me!" the voice pleaded. Mark's pulse raced as he took a cautious step forward, his eyes locked on the painting. It felt wrong. The woman in the portrait, who had seemed so lifeless before, now looked almost alive. Her eyes, once cold and lifeless, seemed to follow him. He could almost see the sorrow in them, the desperation. The whisper grew into a low sob, echoing throughout the cabin. Mark turned and rushed back upstairs, his mind spinning. He couldn't explain it, none of it made sense, but he knew something was wrong. He needed to wake the others. He burst into the room, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Julie! Heather!" Kevin! Rachel! His voice cracked in the stillness, and the others stood in their sleep, confused. What's wrong? Heather mumbled, sitting up groggily. Her eyes flickered toward Mark in the dim light. What's going on? I heard something. There's something in the house, Mark said, his voice shaky. Kevin groaned and rubbed his eyes. Dude, it's just the wind. You're imagining things. But Mark could see it in their faces, their uncertainty. The atmosphere in the house had changed. It was heavier now, thick with a sense of dread that hung in the air. Julie got out of bed and walked over to the window. I thought I saw something moving out there in the fog, she said, her voice quiet. What do you mean? Like a person? Rachel asked, her voice tinged with fear. Julie shook her head. No, it was too quick, too fast. But there was something. Something out there. There was a pause, a long silence that stretched on for what felt like hours. Maybe we should just leave, Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. This place doesn't feel right. Something's off. Julie shook her head, trying to hide the fear that had crept into her own voice. It's just our imaginations. We're fine. Let's just stick together and get through the night. Tomorrow we'll leave, okay? The group reluctantly agreed, though none of them felt particularly reassured. They huddled together on the bed, the tension thick between them. As they lay in silence, waiting for sleep to claim them, the sound of the wind picked up again, howling outside the cabin, making the trees creak and groan in the darkness. But this time, there was something different. Something deeper. A shadow passed by the window, moving too quickly to be a person. And with it came the voice again, soft, broken, and full of sorrow. Help me, before it's too late. Chapter 3, The Unraveling. The night passed in uneasy silence. None of them slept, their minds too tangled with the strange whispers and unsettling visions that had plagued them. The wind outside still howled through the trees, but now it felt more like a mournful cry, echoing through the forest. Mark couldn't shake the image of the woman in the portrait. Her sorrowful eyes seemed to be burned into his mind. The morning light finally broke through the fog, casting long rays through the windows of the cabin. But despite the bright day, the heavy weight of fear hung over the group like a shadow. The warmth of the sunlight seemed to do little to ease the chill in the air. Julie, usually the most optimistic, had a strained expression on her face. The carefree atmosphere they had hoped for had been replaced by unease. And now even the simplest tasks, like making coffee, felt like an ordeal. They gathered in the kitchen, trying to act normal, but the conversations were strained and forced. Mark couldn't stop glancing out the window toward the lake. The fog had lifted slightly, but the water still looked unnaturally still, reflecting the surrounding trees in perfect, eerie symmetry. It was as though the lake was holding its breath, waiting for something. I think we should leave today, Rachel said suddenly, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Her voice was firm, but there was a tremor beneath it. This place, it's not right. Mark nodded, his face pale. I don't think I can stay another night here. I keep hearing things, and the woman in the painting. I swear she was looking at me last night. Kevin, who had remained skeptical up until now, finally spoke up, his voice quiet but serious. I'm with you. There's something about this place. I don't know what it is, but it feels like we're being watched. Julie's face twisted in hesitation, but she eventually sighed. the weight of the situation settling over her. All right, fine. We'll pack up and head out. But we need to check the place first. I mean, we can't just leave without looking around. Heather, ever the curious one, spoke up. What if there's a history to this place? What if we're missing something? Mark froze. What do you mean? I don't know, Heather said, glancing nervously at the portrait. It's just, it feels like there's more to this house. Maybe someone lived here before, maybe someone died. Julie shot her a look. Heather, you're not suggesting. But Heather interrupted, her voice growing more insistent. What if the woman in the picture is more than just an old portrait? What if she's part of the house's history? Maybe her spirit is tied to the place. Maybe that's why we're hearing those whispers. Why we feel trapped. The room fell silent. The idea hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Mark couldn't deny that something felt off about the woman in the picture. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that she had seemed too real, too alive. He remembered how her eyes had followed him when he looked at the portrait, and the way her sorrowful expression had seemed to deepen when he turned away. We need answers, Heather said, her voice steady now. Let's explore the house, look for clues. Maybe there's something we can find. Reluctantly, the group agreed. They set out to search the cabin, starting with the attic. The narrow staircase creaked as they made their way up into the dusty, dimly lit space. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and mildew. Julie flicked on the light, and they began to rummage through the boxes and old furniture piled in the corner. Mark's eyes landed on an old chest tucked against the far wall. The wood was worn and cracked, but it looked sturdy. He approached it cautiously and opened the lid. Inside, there were a few scattered personal items, old clothing, dusty books, and what appeared to be a set of journals. His heart skipped a beat when he noticed a small, leather-bound book tucked underneath a bundle of old clothes. Hey, look at this, Mark said, pulling the book out. Julie and Heather crowded around him as he flipped open the cover. The pages were yellowed with age, the handwriting faded but still legible. The first page read, "The Last Days of Charlotte Green, 1906. The name struck a chord with Mark. It was the same name as the woman in the portrait. I knew it, Heather whispered. It's her. Charlotte Green. Mark turned the page, his fingers trembling slightly as he read aloud the first few lines. I never believed in ghosts, but now I wonder. The house has become a prison. I hear her whispering to me at night, calling my name, begging for help. But what can I do? How can I help someone who is already dead? The group fell silent. Julie stepped closer, her brow furrowed in confusion. This is crazy. This woman was she living here? What happened to her? Mark flipped through the pages, reading snippets of Charlotte's journals. As he did, he learned that Charlotte had once been the owner of the cabin, living there with her husband. But something had gone horribly wrong. There were mentions of a tragic accident at the lake, where her husband had drowned. Charlotte had blamed herself, spiraling into grief and madness. The final entries were disturbing, describing how she heard voices at night, whispers calling her name from the woods. The last entry was dated just days before her death. I have seen her. The woman in the mist. She is coming for me. I can feel her breath on my neck. She wants me to join her in the water. But I won't go. I won't. Mark's hands shook as he closed the book. She killed herself, he said, his voice low. Rachel shivered. But why? Why is she still here? Why is she haunting this place? Julie's eyes were wide with fear. I think I know. I think Charlotte was trying to help someone who had drowned in the lake. But in doing so, she tied herself to the cabin. And now, she's trapped. And so are we. The whispers returned then, faint but unmistakable. Help me, the voice whispered, just outside the attic door. The group froze. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he turned to face the door. Something was coming. Something was waiting. Chapter 4, The Unforgiven. The whispering voice echoed through the attic, its words barely audible, but haunting enough to send shivers down the group's spines. Mark, his heart pounding in his chest, motioned for everyone to stay quiet. The air was thick with tension as they all stared at the attic door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The voice came again, louder this time, as if whatever it was on the other side of that door had grown impatient. Help me, before it's too late. It was undeniably Charlotte's voice, pleading, broken, and desperate. Rachel, her hands trembling, moved closer to the edge of the room, but Julie quickly stopped her. Don't go near it, Julie whispered. We don't know what we're dealing with. Mark took a deep breath. We have to. This is it. We're connected to her now. She's not going to let us go until we understand what happened. Heather looked at the others, fear written across her face. What if she's not the only one here? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What if there's something worse? Something that caused her to become this? Julie's face paled. What do you mean? I don't know, Heather replied, shaking her head. But all these whispers, the feelings of being watched, it's too much. What if Charlotte isn't the one who needs help? What if it's the thing that's haunting her, that thing in the lake? Mark's stomach churned at the thought. The lake. The very place where Charlotte's husband had drowned. But before anyone could respond, a heavy thud reverberated through the walls of the cabin. It came from downstairs, followed by a chilling, almost unnatural silence. The sound of wind whistling through the cracks in the cabin seemed to grow louder, drowning out their voices. What was that? Kevin asked, his voice strained. He was looking around the attic, his eyes wide with panic. I don't know, but I'm not staying here to find out, Rachel said, backing away from the door. Wait, Mark said, his voice calm but firm. We need to understand. We need to find out what really happened to Charlotte. This house, this place, is a part of her. If we leave now, we'll never have the answers. And it'll keep coming for us. Julie nodded slowly, though her face was a mix of fear and determination. He's right. We can't just run from this. We need to finish it. Reluctantly, the group agreed. They walked down the narrow stairs of the attic, the weight of the decision hanging heavily on their shoulders. Mark felt the cold, oppressive atmosphere closing in around them as they made their way back to the main floor. As they reached the living room, the fire in the hearth had gone out completely, leaving the room dark and still. The shadows were now deeper, more menacing. The air was thick with an unsettling silence that made every step feel like an intrusion. The whispers had stopped, but the tension in the air was palpable. They moved carefully toward the front door, determined to search for more answers, but as Mark reached for the handle, a loud bang from behind them made him freeze. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. "What the hell?" Kevin shouted, his voice panicked. Before anyone could respond, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. A frosty chill filled the air, and Mark's breath became visible in the sudden cold. The room grew darker still, as though the house was swallowing up the light. The woman's voice returned, now frantic, desperate. "You have to leave. You have to leave now." But it wasn't Charlotte's voice this time. It was a different, deeper voice, darker, filled with malice. Heather gasped. "What the hell is that?" Mark felt his pulse race. "We've disturbed something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just Charlotte. It's something else." The group turned toward the windows, but the sight that greeted them made their blood run cold. The fog had rolled in thick around the cabin again, but it wasn't the same. This time, it was swirling, almost as if it had a life of its own. Figures, dark, formless shapes, moved through the mist, their outlines indistinct but terrifying. They were closing in. Mark's voice shook. "We need to get out. Now." Julie grabbed his arm, her face ashen. "We can't leave. The cabin, it won't let us." Suddenly, the temperature plummeted even further, and the wind outside began to howl. A soft scratching sound filled the room, coming from the walls. It was as if the house itself was alive, clawing at them, trying to trap them inside. Rachel backed away from the door. "This place is cursed. It's keeping us here." Then, with a violent crash, the attic door flew open, slamming against the wall. A gust of cold air rushed in, and the sound of muffled, unintelligible whispers flooded the room. "Get to the attic!" Heather shouted, her voice cutting through the panic. "We have to finish what we started." They rushed to the stairs, the house seeming to fight against them every step of the way. The floorboards groaned beneath their feet, and the walls seemed to close in as if they were being squeezed by an unseen hand. When they reached the attic, Mark slammed the door shut behind them, his breath ragged in the freezing air. They looked around, but this time, the room was different. The chest they had opened earlier was now wide open, the journals scattered across the floor. But something else was there, something dark, something that hadn't been there before. A figure stood in the corner, barely visible in the shadows. It was Charlotte. But not the woman they had seen in the portrait. Her eyes were wide, filled with terror, and her mouth hung open in a silent scream. Her skin was pale and stretched thin, her hair matted and tangled. She was reaching toward them, her hands outstretched. "No!" Julie screamed, backing away, but the door slammed shut behind them. The room grew even colder as the figure began to move toward them. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them, as if the very walls of the cabin were alive with voices, Charlotte's, and the voices of something darker, something that had been waiting for them. It was too late to run. They were trapped. Chapter 5: The Water's Call. The figure of Charlotte advanced, her outstretched hands reaching toward them. The room seemed to grow colder with every step she took. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel the air thickening around him, pressing in on his lungs. It was as though the house itself was closing in, suffocating them. Julie, her voice trembling with fear, took a step back. "What is she? What happened to her?" she whispered, barely able to keep her composure. Heather, her face pale and her hands shaking, reached out to grab the nearest object, one of the journals that had spilled across the floor. "It's not her," she shouted. "It's not Charlotte. Look! It's something else. It's using her form to keep us here." The ghostly figure, Charlotte, came closer, her hollow eyes locked on them with an intensity that sent a wave of dread crashing through Mark's chest. Her mouth moved, but no sound came from her lips, only the rush of wind and the echoes of whispers. Then, suddenly, her mouth opened wide, wider than it should have, and a chilling, bone-shaking scream tore through the room. It wasn't Charlotte anymore. It was something monstrous, something ancient. The sound made Mark's ears ring, and he stumbled backward, his hands grabbing for anything to steady himself. "Run!" Kevin shouted, but it was too late. The figure lunged forward, its hands now mere inches from them. The room felt as if it were collapsing inward, the air thick and stifling. The temperature plunged even lower, so cold that Mark felt his breath freeze in his lungs, as if the very life was being sucked out of him. But then, just as Charlotte's ghost reached for him, the floor beneath them shifted. A deafening crack split the air, and the entire attic trembled, the walls groaning as though they were about to cave in. The swirling whispers suddenly turned to a deafening roar, and the ground beneath their feet buckled. Mark's legs gave way, and he fell to his knees. The others were shouting, scrambling to stay on their feet, but it was impossible. The very foundation of the cabin seemed to be breaking apart, the old wood splintering like dry leaves in the wind. And then, all at once, the floor gave way completely. Mark felt himself falling, the darkness swallowing him whole. Mark gasped as he hit the cold, hard floor below. His vision was blurry, and for a moment, he couldn't tell where he was. The sound of water was unmistakable, crashing against something. He blinked, his eyes struggling to focus as he pushed himself up from the ground. It was the basement. The others were scattered around him, all struggling to get to their feet. They looked just as disoriented as he felt. Their surroundings were dim, lit only by the faint light coming from a single, flickering bulb overhead. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and the stone walls were damp, their surfaces slick with moisture. And then, they all turned toward the far corner of the room. Mark's stomach dropped. The water. A small, stagnant pool had formed in the corner, the murky water swirling and bubbling, as though it had a life of its own. The surface of the water was rippling, disturbed by something unseen beneath it. And at the edge of the pool stood a figure. It wasn't Charlotte this time. It was something worse. The figure was tall and thin, its face obscured by a hood. Its hands were long, unnaturally long, with fingers that looked like twisted branches. The figure stood silently by the water, its head tilted to one side, as though it was waiting for them. "We're too late," Heather whispered, her voice filled with dread. "It's here. It's the thing that killed her. The thing in the lake." Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly backed away, his eyes fixed on the figure. Who is it?" But Heather couldn't answer. She was staring at the pool, her eyes wide with fear. "It's not just her. It's all of them. It's the thing that takes them. It's the thing that feeds on their souls." The figure took a step forward, its footsteps making no sound. The water in the pool surged violently, splashing over the edges. The air turned cold, so cold that Mark could see his breath crystallized in the air. And then, the figure spoke. Its voice was low, guttural, and ancient, like the very earth was speaking through it. You should not have come. Julie's face went pale as she stepped forward, her voice trembling. Who are you? The figure tilted its head further, its hollow eyes glinting with malice. I am the keeper of the lake, it said, its voice carrying an unnerving calm. I am the one who watches, who waits. Mark felt a cold shiver run through him. The lake, he asked, his voice shaky. What does that mean? The figure didn't respond. Instead, it reached out one of its long, twisted hands toward the water. The surface rippled again, and something beneath it began to move. The water churned as a dark shape began to rise. It was Charlotte. But she was no longer the woman they had seen in the portrait. Her body was bloated and pale, her eyes wide and empty. She was floating in the water, her face twisted in a silent scream. Mark couldn't look away. What did you do to her? He shouted, his voice breaking. What is this? Why is she here? The figure's eyes gleamed with something sinister. She was a sacrifice, it said. A sacrifice to the water. And now, she has joined me. As will you, if you do not leave. Julie stepped forward, her eyes filled with both fear and defiance. We can't just leave. We have to stop this. We have to stop it from taking anyone else. The figure's mouth twisted into a twisted grin. You cannot stop it, it hissed. The lake takes what it is owed. It always has. And it always will. Mark looked at the others, their faces filled with terror. They had to do something. But what? How could they fight something so powerful, something that had existed for so long? And then, the whispers began again, this time louder, more frantic. Charlotte's voice joined them, pleading. Help me. Help me before it's too late. Chapter 6, The Final Descent. The whispers continued to swirl around them, growing louder with each passing second. The air in the basement felt thick with dread, and the cold, oppressive presence of the figure lingered in every corner. Charlotte's distorted form floated in the water, her empty eyes pleading for something, anything, that might free her from the horrors she had become part of. Julie stepped back, her heart racing as she tried to steady herself. We need to do something, she said, her voice barely a whisper, hoarse with fear. We can't just stand here and wait for it to take us too. The figure standing by the pool didn't move, but its presence was enough to freeze them in place. Its hollow eyes never left them. It was as if the very walls of the basement were closing in, suffocating them with the weight of its ancient power. Mark's eyes darted between the others. They had to act, and fast. He couldn't let this thing take them, couldn't let Charlotte's fate be theirs. We have to break the cycle. We have to stop it from taking anyone else. Kevin shook his head. How? It's too powerful. We saw what it did to Charlotte. What makes you think we can stop it? Julie's face tightened with determination. It's not about stopping it directly. We need to find out how to break its hold. Charlotte was tied to this place because of her guilt, her grief. We need to understand what's really happening here. Heather nodded, her voice shaky but resolute. It's in the water, isn't it? It's feeding off of the lake, of the people who drown, of the guilt, of the pain. Charlotte couldn't escape because she was bound by her own suffering. Mark turned toward the pool, his eyes narrowing. And the figure, the keeper. It's feeding off all of it. Off of her, and now us. The figure tilted its head slightly, its unblinking eyes never wavering from them. It was almost as if it could hear their thoughts, as if it was feeding on their fear and uncertainty. Suddenly, a realization struck Mark. Wait. The journals. Charlotte, she was trying to help someone, wasn't she? She wasn't just trying to escape the thing in the lake. She was trying to free someone else. Maybe she knew the key to breaking the cycle. Julie's eyes widened in understanding. You're right. She knew something that could stop it. We need to find the answer in her journals. Mark grabbed the closest journal that had fallen to the floor earlier, his fingers trembling as he opened it. The words on the pages were frantic, written in Charlotte's unmistakable scrawl. As he read aloud, the others gathered around, listening intently. I am losing my mind. The water is calling me. Every night, I hear it, its whispers, its promise of peace. But I cannot go. I cannot join the lake. The voices are getting louder. It will take me soon, but I must try to stop it. If I can help another, if I can show them the way, then maybe the curse will be lifted. Mark's eyes widened as he continued reading. She knew. She knew what the lake wanted. It feeds on sorrow, on guilt. And if it doesn't have someone to consume, it goes after the next person. Julie stepped forward, her voice shaking but firm. Charlotte was trying to save herself by saving someone else. She thought that if she helped another soul find peace, the lake wouldn't claim her. She was sacrificing herself for others. Mark looked at Charlotte's body floating in the water, her once lifeless face now twisted in a silent scream, begging for help. But she couldn't escape it. The guilt, it kept her here. She couldn't move on. None of us can until we help. Heather's eyes were filled with realization. The lake, it's not just physical. It's tied to the emotions, to the trauma of the people who drown in it. That's why the voices never stop. That's why Charlotte, she couldn't break free. Kevin, his voice tinged with a mix of fear and understanding, looked at the water. So we have to give something to it. Something to end the cycle? Julie nodded slowly. Yes. We have to find a way to break the emotional chain. The water is feeding off of the pain. But we can't just give it more of what it wants. We have to offer something that can break the curse, something pure. The figure in the corner seemed to sense their growing resolve, its eyes narrowing with malice. It began to move toward them, its long, twisted hands reaching out once more. You cannot escape me, it hissed in its deep, guttural voice, its words shaking the air. You are already mine. All of you. Mark grabbed Julie's hand, pulling her toward the water. We have to do it now, before it takes any more of us. Julie hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. Together, they stood at the edge of the pool, looking down at Charlotte's ghostly form, floating lifelessly in the murky water. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, almost suffocating. Mark reached into the water, his fingers brushing against the surface. The cold was biting, freezing him to the bone, but he didn't stop. He had to find a way to end it. Charlotte, he whispered, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. We're going to free you. We're going to stop it. The figure in the corner screeched, its arms outstretched as if to pull them into the water. The cold intensified, and Mark could feel the pressure of something unseen pressing against him. But then, something shifted. The water rippled, and Charlotte's form began to shift as well. The figure froze, its twisted hands falling to its sides. The whispers became softer, as though they were being muffled by something deeper, something heavier. Charlotte's ghostly form began to rise from the water, her eyes no longer hollow with despair, but filled with a faint glimmer of peace. She reached out to them, her hand trembling as it hovered just above the surface of the water. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, almost drowned by the echoes of the lake. "Thank you for freeing me." With that, her figure began to dissipate, vanishing into the mist above the water. The air around them cleared, the oppressive cold lifting as if it had never been there. The lake stilled, its churning waters now calm and serene. The figure, the keeper, staggered back, its form flickering like a dying flame. With one final, guttural screech, it dissolved into nothing, leaving only the quiet of the cabin behind. The group stood in silence, their breaths ragged as they tried to comprehend what had just happened. They had done it. They had freed Charlotte, and in doing so, had broken the curse that had plagued the cabin for so long. As they made their way back upstairs, the cabin felt different. The air was warmer, the light brighter. The weight of fear and guilt that had hung over them was gone. But Mark knew one thing for certain. The lake would always hold its secrets, and the shadows would always linger, waiting for another soul to stumble too close to its depths. And in the silence that followed, they understood. Some things were better left undiscovered. Chapter 7: The Return. The days following the events in the cabin were a blur. The group had left as quickly as they could, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what they had endured. But even as they drove away from the cabin, the unsettling sense of something watching them never quite left. It clung to them like a second skin, an invisible presence lurking in the corners of their minds. Mark couldn't shake the image of the water, its ripples still haunting his thoughts. The voices that had echoed in the cabin seemed to follow him, calling his name in the wind, whispering from just out of sight. And Charlotte's face, her eyes, filled with both sorrow and relief, stayed with him, reminding him that the darkness they had encountered had not been defeated, only delayed. The group, once close friends, had become distant in the aftermath. Their conversations had grown quieter, filled with unease, as if each of them feared speaking too much about what they had experienced. They went their separate ways, trying to return to their normal lives, but the shadow of the lake lingered in their minds. It was a month later when the first sign came. Mark was at home, sitting at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee in hand, when his phone buzzed on the counter. It was an unfamiliar number. Hesitantly, he picked it up. "Hello?" "Mark," a voice said on the other end, its tone familiar but strained. "It's Julie." "Julie?" Mark's heart skipped a beat. "What's wrong?" There was a long pause before she spoke again. "You were right. We didn't finish it. The lake, it's not done with us." Mark's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "I've been hearing it again," she whispered, her voice cracking. "The whispers. They're calling me. It's like I'm being pulled back. And I saw something last night. Something in the water. It wasn't Charlotte, but it was something. Something darker." Mark's mind raced. "Julie, no. You have to stay away from the lake. We broke the curse. It's over." "I don't think we did," Julie said, her voice barely audible. "I think the lake is still hungry. And it's coming for all of us." Mark's thoughts spiraled, a mix of fear and disbelief churning in his gut. He remembered the way the figure had vanished, the sense of finality in Charlotte's release. But now, Julie's words felt like a breaking point. They had left the cabin, but the curse had never truly let them go. It was always watching, always waiting. "I'll come to you," Mark said quickly, standing up and grabbing his coat. We'll figure this out. We'll finish it, once and for all. The drive back to the lake felt like an eternity. As Mark neared the familiar road, the trees surrounding him seemed darker, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, clawing at the sky. The air had grown colder, and the once peaceful surroundings now felt oppressive, as if the land itself was watching him. He arrived at Julie's house, her face pale and strained as she opened the door. "I'm glad you came," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I don't know how much longer I can take it." Mark noticed the exhaustion in her eyes and the way her hands trembled as she clasped them together. She had never looked so fragile. "I thought we were done with this," Mark said, his voice filled with frustration. "I thought we ended it." "We did," Julie replied, her eyes darting nervously to the window. "But something's wrong. I can feel it. The lake's power is still here. And I think it's calling to me. It won't leave me alone." Julie's words sent a chill through Mark. He could hear the desperation in her voice, but there was something more, a growing fear that the lake was not finished with them, that it had simply been biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike. "We have to go back," Julie said suddenly, her voice firm despite the fear. "We have to stop it. I can't, none of us can, live like this." Mark nodded. He knew they couldn't keep running from what they had faced. The lake, the darkness, whatever it was still out there, and it was waiting for them. The two of them drove back to the cabin that evening, the landscape outside looking eerily familiar, but somehow more sinister. The fog had rolled in once again, thick and oppressive, covering everything in its cold embrace. When they reached the cabin, it was just as it had been before, silent and still, as if nothing had changed. But Mark could feel it now, the presence of something dark, something ancient, lingering in the air. "I don't like this," Julie muttered, her voice tight with anxiety. "It feels wrong." "Stay close," Mark said, as they approached the front door. He wasn't sure what they were going to find, but he knew they couldn't leave until they had answers. They entered the cabin cautiously, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The air was colder than it should have been, and the house seemed to groan under an unseen weight, as though it were alive and breathing. They moved through the rooms, searching for any signs of what had happened after they left. But everything appeared untouched. The portraits on the walls, the furniture, even the journals, they were all exactly as they had been when they had left. But something wasn't right. As they reached the living room, Julie gasped, her hand covering her mouth in shock. The portrait, the one of Charlotte, was back on the wall, but this time, the woman's eyes were wide open, her face twisted in a look of horror. Julie stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. "No. It's happening again." Mark felt a knot form in his stomach. They had thought it was over, that Charlotte's release had broken the curse. But now it was clear, the lake was still reaching for them. And this time, it wasn't just Charlotte. It was coming for them all. The whispers started again, faint at first, like the breeze through the trees. But then, they grew louder, filling the room with an overwhelming pressure. "Help me! Come to the water! Join me!" Mark turned to Julie, his face grim. "We have to stop it. Now." And as the whispers intensified, Mark knew that they were no longer just trapped in the house. They were trapped in something far worse, something that was tied to the land, to the lake, and to the darkness that had been waiting for them to return. Chapter 8: The Final Tide. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening. Mark's heart hammered in his chest as he turned to Julie, whose face had gone pale, her eyes wide with terror. They could both feel it now, the darkness that had settled over them like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The lake was calling. The house was shaking with the force of it, the walls groaning as if they were alive. Julie stumbled back from the portrait, her hands shaking. "This is it, Mark. We didn't finish it. We weren't supposed to leave. We were supposed to stay and end it for good." Mark's mind raced. He thought back to the journals, to Charlotte's final words. The figure in the water, the keeper, it wasn't just about breaking the curse. It wasn't just about releasing Charlotte's spirit. It was about confronting the lake, confronting the darkness itself. The house creaked again, louder this time, and a sudden gust of cold air blasted through the room, extinguishing the fire in the hearth. The room went dark, save for the pale glow of moonlight streaming through the windows. Mark turned toward the door. The figure, the one they had seen in the basement, was waiting outside. He could feel it. "Mark," Julie's voice trembled as she took a step toward the window. "It's here." And there, in the distance, he saw it. The lake, now black and still, under the moonlight. It was as if it were a giant mirror, reflecting nothing but darkness. The fog had thickened once more, swirling around the water like an insidious mist, and the shadows that danced on the surface of the lake seemed to stretch toward the cabin. Something was rising from the depths. Mark's breath caught in his throat. "We have to face it," he said, his voice low but resolute. "We can't run anymore. This time, we end it." Julie nodded, swallowing hard. "But how? How do we stop it?" Mark looked around the cabin, his eyes landing on the fireplace. The flame had gone out, but the hearth still held remnants of burned wood. The fire that had once burned bright seemed to be dying, just like their chances of escaping this place. But there was something in it, a connection. They had to ignite the fire again, something symbolic to cleanse the place, to break the hold the lake had on them. "This house is part of it," he said, his voice firm. "The lake, the curse, it's all tied to this cabin. The fire can purify it, burn it away." Julie looked at him with fear and confusion in her eyes. "But how?" Mark walked over to the fireplace, his footsteps slow and deliberate. "The fire needs something more than just wood. We need something personal, something that connects us to the curse. Something that represents the guilt that ties us here. Something Charlotte couldn't let go of." Julie's eyes widened as she realized what he meant. The journals. The things Charlotte left behind. The guilt she carried. Mark nodded. "Yes. We need to burn them all. Every trace of what happened here. We burn it all. Only then will we break free." Julie hesitated for a moment, but then stepped forward. Together, they gathered the journals, the letters, the remnants of the past, and placed them into the fireplace. They had to do this. There was no other choice. But as they lit the fire, the temperature in the cabin dropped further. The air became heavy, thick with the scent of decay. The whispers returned, louder, more frantic, more insistent. "No," a voice screamed from the shadows. "You cannot undo it. You cannot burn it away." Mark's heart raced as he turned toward the door. The figure, the keeper, was standing there, its skeletal form more grotesque than before. Its mouth was open wide in a silent scream, its eyes dark pits of despair. We are its children, the figure intoned, its voice like the cracking of dry earth. We are bound by the lake. You cannot escape. Julie stepped back, her face pale. What is it? What does it want from us? The figure's eyes glowed with an unnatural light. It wants your souls. It wants everything you have, your pain, your fear. And it will not let you go. Not now. Not ever. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The keeper wasn't just a figure. It was the lake. The lake itself, embodied in this twisted, decayed form. And it wasn't going to let them escape. But just as the figure advanced, the fire flared up, burning brighter than it had ever been. The flames grew higher, licking at the walls, and the entire cabin seemed to tremble under the force of it. You have no power here, Mark shouted, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through him. We're not afraid anymore. We're letting it go. Julie stepped forward, her hands trembling but her resolve hardening. We are not your prisoners. We won't be your sacrifice. The fire blazed with a new intensity, casting light that pierced through the darkness. The keeper's form began to writhe, as if the flames were burning it away, erasing its very existence. The air around them crackled, and the whispers grew louder, more chaotic. And then, with one final, bone-rattling screech, the keeper disintegrated into ash, its form dissipating into the flames. The room went still, the oppressive darkness lifting. For the first time since they had arrived, the air felt lighter. The lake's presence was gone. The whispers had stopped. The curse had been broken. Mark and Julie stood in the silence, their breaths ragged, their bodies trembling from the effort. The fire slowly burned down to a soft, steady glow, casting warm light across the room. They had done it. They had broken the cycle. But as Mark turned to Julie, his heart still racing, he knew that while the darkness had been defeated this time, the lake's hunger would never truly be satisfied. There would always be new souls to claim, new victims to lure into its depths. The lake would wait. And somewhere, deep beneath its black surface, the whispers would continue. Thank you for listening to today's story. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Horror Echo. Let us know if you've ever had a similar experience. We'd love to hear your story. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.